I'm very, very humbled by your presence here. Once considered the hallmark of success for a Muslim country with its stability, its economic prosperity, its religious moderation, and its adherence to democratic values, and being at an intersection of Europe and Asia, modern and traditional, Muslim and secular, we find that Turkey again is at this precipice, at this crossroads of uncertainty as to whether any, if not all, of these appellations will prevail moving forward. And I agree, as we heard just right now, the sense of optimism that was there 12 years ago, that this is the moment, this is the country, this is going to be the vanguard, not just for the Muslim world, but for many nations in this evolution moving toward this true economic, cultural, religious, and political progress. There have been several casualties of excessive government encroachment in Turkey. Certain segments of the country's press, of course, especially those elements that have been critical of AKP and the Erdogan administration more specifically, have endured really unspeakable pressures. And what we find then is evidence that fortunately is emerging from external sources. The Committee to Protect Journalists has vigilantly been monitoring the erosion of press freedoms in Turkey and has attempted even to negotiate with the Ankara regime to reverse the government's policies that affect both the dissemination of and access to information, as well as the actions taken against both institutions and individuals alike. And I think that this is very important to understand, that there's individuals that are being targeted as well as organizations, of course the Hizmet movement really at the top of that list. But there is, in a sense, a kind of discriminatory non-discrimination. There is a sweep that is underway at anybody that is seen to be a threat to, and I'll use this term again, the new deep state. The committee declared Turkey to be the world's worst jailer of journalists in 2012, excuse me, 2013, and within the top 10 of 2014. And many of you are probably familiar with some of the examples of this. For example, Erfan Aktan, a reporter for the Monthly Express, and Merva Erol, and pardon my pronunciation on Turkish names, I can only bring my Urdu background to create a correlation with Turkish. His editor were both convicted under Article 7 of the anti-terrorism law in June of 2010, and I'll speak a little bit later about the invocation of this particular law and why it is especially pernicious. Aktan was sentenced to 15 months in prison. Erol fined 16,000 Turkish lira, and that wasn't even the end of the story. The sentencing has shifted several times in between. The case of Dervish Genç, photographer for Today's Zaman, detained recently for simply taking pictures at a pro-government rally. The license of Kanal Türk TV being suspended. The government filing lawsuits against Today's Zaman editor-in-chief Bülent Keneş and deputy editor Mehmet Kamiş, alleging that they, quote-unquote, and coming from an American perspective, you've got to love this word, humiliating President Erdogan on Twitter. This, of course, then becomes such a criminal offense. President Erdogan alleged that Emre Uslu, a columnist with Today's Zaman, and Önder Aytaç, a journalist formerly with the independent newspaper Taraf, were involved in a national security leak. In December of 2014, even the other hallowed institution of Turkey was not spared. Members of Çarşı, a fan club belonging to Beşiktaş, were ordered to stand trial under anti-terror statutes for their alleged role in the Gezi protests of June 2013. Erdogan's own attitude in response to the social media site and his disdain and contempt for it can be encapsulated, according to the Washington Post of December 30th, 2014, Twitter Mwitter. Apparently, tell us how you really feel about it. Without any sense of irony, President Erdogan has asserted on several occasions that, quote, Turkey has the world's freest press. The real irony, however, concerns his proclamation occurring at literally the same time that a Dutch journalist, Frederik Geerdink, was called in for questioning. This is a somewhat unique case given the fact that Geerdink is a foreign reporter. On the same day, Sedef Kabash was again called in for questioning, apparently for tweets that she made regarding the abrupt closure of a major corruption case against government officials. And only a couple of weeks before that, police raided the homes and offices of other journalists as part of this crackdown on the Hizmet movement. Kabash herself was detained for posting, get this, a single tweet. She posted on Twitter a picture of a judge who had dropped a high-profile corruption probe and telling her 18,000 plus followers to not forget his name. Just to give you a comparison, the President of the United States has somewhere on the lines of 30 million followers. Here we got 18,000. In an interview with the Turkish website Radikal, she said her home was raided, police demanding that she hand over her phone, laptop, and iPad, and she was accused of targeting people who were involved in anti-terror operations. And I know for most of you who enjoy your phone and your laptop and your iPad, you would invoke Charlton Heston by saying, "Out of my cold, dead hand." In March, there was a hostage crisis just a few weeks ago where two gunmen took captive a Turkish prosecutor, Mehmet Selim Kiraz, in Istanbul. The ordeal ended with all three being shot dead. Kiraz was investigating the death of Berkin Elvan, who was the young boy who died a year after the Gezi Park protest with a tear gas canister that hit him in his head, and again he died of his wounds in a very painful way and a prolonged way. Mustafa Aykul, the journalist and writer, has stated that the government has used the hostage crisis to label non-pro-government newspapers as supporters of terrorism. And of course, chief among these as targeted is today's Zaman and Zaman itself. So again, we find that this narrative is building up regarding people who are seditious, organizations, individuals that are seen as somehow or the other a threat to the quote-unquote progress of the current regime. Erdogan can take a great level of comfort and almost insularity in the fact that Turkey is promoted as a stable regime, one not descending into chaos, particularly when one sees the neighborhood in which Turkey finds itself. He's able to then invoke these notions of order and security against jihadists and inept and amateur politicians, and most dangerously, he's able to then go ahead and position himself as a bulwark against this kind of chaos and standing for quote-unquote true democracy. The fact that Turkey is a NATO ally, a G20 country, and considered by the G8 to be a regional power is something that, again, are several feathers in Erdogan's hat to be able to have a wide berth and deference in what he does when we see the international community's response to it. It is a frontline ally in the war against ISIS. It is a pivotal geostrategic entity in the midst of two very dangerous conflict zones right now, the Middle East and Ukraine. And so this becomes, again, part of the talking points that the government is able to invoke, particularly to those regimes which don't want to get their hands dirty themselves. They don't want to invoke their own heavy lifting in these conflicts, as well as recognizing, again, the similarity of the regime's policies to their own. More on that in a second. At the same time, however, Turkey has successfully been able to gain cover for government policies that restrict press and civil society by delineating the hypocritical nature of European voices that call indignantly for Turkish compliance to international norms of human rights. Several EU countries, for example, have enacted fairly similar anti-terror laws under the guise of national security that sharply increase surveillance of citizens, obtain metadata, monitor communications, including the internet, and even target various groups that are deemed to be antisocial, subversive, and are potentially dangerous, as defined by no mere coincidence, those respective governments themselves. Nearly all G8 countries have enacted in the last 5 years anti-terror laws that have far reach in the arenas of surveillance and securitization, and consequently have the effect of impinging upon human rights, again, under the guise of security and counterterrorism. Canada, the United States, Germany, France, the UK, the EU as a whole France, Italy tried but tabled their law. Russia did, but it's suspended from the G8 because it's naughty. The only country out of the G8 that has not either attempted or enacted anti-terror laws is Japan. It says a lot for being an island out in the Pacific, I suppose. There's also the notion of what lies between Erdogan's rhetoric and reality. As a historian who teaches Ottoman and Turkish history, I'm always vexed by his invocation of Ottoman history in a kind of neo-Ottomanist revivalism. He loves to talk about the Sultan Abdülhamid II, who reigned from 1876 until 1908. Well, among his many other attributes, say what you will about Abdülhamid, it was in 1878 that he invoked emergency rule himself, suspended the constitution, and dissolved parliament. Again, on the guise of saying that the nation was under threat by both internal and external forces. So the irony that Erdogan is invoking him, trying to imply that he is emulating him, is really hitting very close to the mark. Clearly then, what is occurring in Turkey reflects part of a global phenomenon, where the most powerful nation-states are enacting laws that curtail human rights. Most, if not all, of these countries are democracies that claim to adhere to the rule of law and pledge to uphold the primacy of human rights. The late French philosopher Michel Foucault focused heavily on the phenomenon of power, especially governmentality, the tactics that are deployed by governments to control and rule over their subjects. Foucault's related category of biopower is a technology of power. It informs the emergence of the nation-state and capitalism to regulate subjects. It's also helpful in an effort to understand the tactics of the current regime and other states to pay attention to Foucault's concept of the knowledge regime. Within the realm of this regime, certain assertions, beliefs, and arguments about the Hizmet movement, specifically here, are regarded as given truths through the logic of repetition itself and due to the fact that they are consonant with what we have always heard and therefore know. You say it enough times, and especially if the pushback is limited, those things become truths in and of themselves. So one sees the danger of staying silent. The hyper-surveillance, the securitization, the stifling of expression and assembly, and other human rights violations, particularly the targeting of specific groups like the Hizmet movement, affirm Foucault's idea and concept of the panopticon, this idea of being under perpetual surveillance for social control. The public thus internalizes a consciousness of being under constant surveillance by the state. If there were a camera here, it doesn't matter if the camera is on or not. We would feel as though the camera is on. We would have that presumption. When he attained power in 2003, one of Erdogan's key priorities was to purge Turkey of the so-called deep state, the derin devlet, or state within a state, defined as a group of influential anti-democratic coalitions within the Turkish political system composed of high-level elements within the intelligence services, both foreign and domestic, the Turkish military, security, judiciary, and the media. While he may have conducted his campaign to expunge the Kemalists from power, the question is whether he indeed abolished the deep state or whether he merely co-opted it. The idea of the reorganization of Turkey around a corporate culture has created now a corporate state or a corporate deep state. One must ask the question whether the Hizmet movement is the new target simply because of its unwillingness to become part of that deep state. The resentment, the hostility, and the antagonism that is being directed toward the Hizmet movement is simply because they refuse to play along. When we're talking about the issue of privatization and the corporate state, we have to also then take parallels that we can draw from the United States. Debates that are currently going on when it comes to the privatization of prisons, when it comes to the privatization of schools, these all then create a new node of collaboration, complicity, and one might even say conspiracy between the corporate and the state apparatuses. This is critical to then understand that with the guise of national security being invoked time and time again in Turkey, as well as in other states throughout Europe, as well as in the United States and Canada, we have to then call into question whether Erdogan's model is something that is new, or whether he himself is just now playing along with a broader structure of the corporate state being involved. The challenge then is to challenge Erdogan, but also to recognize these parallels. As Erdogan is suspending Twitter or YouTube or Google, one has to ask the questions about the national security agencies' co-opting of Google, Facebook, Twitter, and several other social media outlets in order to then extract, harvest, obtain, and retain metadata, create the surveillance panopticon, and create their own deep states. The challenge then in trying to push back on Erdogan and to try to, as was stated before, persuade our political leaders to do something about it is to call out our own political leaders to see if they're simply part of the same hypocrisy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Han. I appreciate your